Welcome back to this module on Frontiers of the Future. You may remember that in the last couple of sessions, we've been looking at energetic architecture. At the beginning, looking at the basic concept, and in the second session, looking at how do we start to understand it more, break it down into different pieces that we can start to make sense of and get information about. That's what you see again on the slide here. Remember these different elements of the energetic architecture that have come out of this practice developed by the Center for Ecotherapy in the Netherlands. So grounding, how grounded it is, how much its information, how much its ideas are integrated into the realization, how fit it is in its context, how fit the organization is in its context, how much life energy is in the system, and how much blocked and stressed energy. And we looked at those existing at these three levels. At the concept level, where ideas are made in the organization, at realization level, where stuff is turned into action and product, and then at that middle level, where communication takes place internally and externally in the organization. And what we're going to do in this session is we're going to go on to look at some practices for actually engaging with those different levels. So how can we start to intervene at the level of the energetic architecture to enhance the coherence of that architecture so that it can inform both the relational and the material levels and make our organizations more fit for these times that we're in. Before we go into that, just to say a little bit about how we go about measuring that information. Because we're working at the energetic level here, so it's not stuff that we can see with our eyes. And the way in this particular practice through the Center for Ecotherapy, and in many other energetic practices actually, that we access information, is primarily through our body. And we may think that's strange because these are more subtle energetic realities, but it's actually the body that's able to read that information and tell us what seems to fit and what doesn't. And a good example of this is what's called kinesiology, also known as muscle testing. And you may have done this before, it's quite common, but you can easily do this with your friends and check it out. One example of this is you put your arm out, for example, like in this picture here, and you test to see if it's weak or if it's strong when you push down, when your friend pushes down on it. So you're being strong here in the muscle at the shoulder, and then someone's trying to push it down. You'll find when you say your own name, if you say like, my name is Peter, then my muscle here is strong and the arm stays up. If I say something that isn't true, like my name is Sally, then actually I feel my arm be a lot weaker than it was when I said my name is Peter. That's something you can play with your friends. So there's something that happens in the electrical system in our body that when something is true or resonates, it makes us stronger, has a certain reaction in the body. And when we say things that aren't true or don't fit, then we have a different reaction in the body. It makes us weaker energetically. This is quite a well-established field of practice that you can find more information on in the resource library. So if we take that basic idea that our body has an electrical energy in it, which is also a fairly common accepted concept, then the way we work with getting information is through what's called dowsing. Dowsing is, for example, with a pendulum, being able to, if you have a little pendulum on a string or something held in your hand, and you ask a question like, is my name Peter? And it'll move in a certain direction. And is my name Sally? And it says no, it'll move in a different direction. Now, one of the things that often comes up in, say, more New Age circles is that it's the pendulum that's moving. Something outside is moving the pendulum. Well, that's all not true. It's coming through the body. So the body is making a certain movement generated by its electrical system that makes the pendulum move in one direction and move in the other direction. So you can make an agreement. You say, okay, here's my pendulum. If the answer to this question is yes, I want it to move this way. And if the answer is no, I want it to move that way. And that way you can test information. So, is this organization well-grounded? Yes. Is it not well-grounded? No. And you can see a lot more information about how to work with dowsing in the resource library, but that's basically the way it works. Any pendulum, anything, it's not about the quality of the pendulum. I've made one from a nut and bolt before, and it works just as well as a nice one I have from a crystal. It's about the fact that it's an extension of your arm, and the tiny movement that comes through your fingers due to the electrical field in your body is accelerated in the movement of the pendulum, so you can see it more clearly. So you can also use the pendulum on scales. If I'm saying how grounded is the organization from 0 to 100%, and I start with 0 and it's just moving, and I just say, when I get to the right number, then start to turn. So when we get to say, 50, 60%, it starts to turn, then I know that the groundedness of the organization is at that level. So that's the way, through this particular approach, we work with getting the information from the energetic architecture. One of the other pieces I want to share with you before we go on to talk more about how we intervene in the energetic architecture is some research that was done at Princeton University. 28 years of research carried out through the engineering department in something they call the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. And this was a program where they were noticing that were certain things happening, particularly in the cockpits of fighter aircraft and rockets, where there's highly sensitive instrumentation. And they were noticing some strange anomalies that couldn't be explained. It seemed to be that there was a relationship between the interior state of the pilot and what was happening on the instruments in front of them. So they started off on this, what ended up being a very long research project, looking at how does the intention of somebody affect matter? How does it affect, for example, a computer? And the basic research involved was where they had computer generating ones and zeros. So they called it a random event generator. So if the computer generates enough ones and zeros, what it does is it creates 50-50, 50% ones and 50% zeros. And of course, a computer can create millions of these in a short time. What they then did is that they would have people try to concentrate on generating more ones or more zeros in the computer. So the intention would be generate more ones, for example. And this was shown to have a statistically significant effect on the computer. So when somebody started thinking more ones, then the computer would generate more ones. Or more zeros, it would generate more zeros. So you then maybe get 49, 51% in the balance. And that would happen where there's actually no physical connection between the person and the computer. In fact, it would even happen when somebody was on the other side of the world with that intention would still impact the computer. Now, this is explainable by the latest science and the quantum physics, which says that at that level, time and space really don't operate in the same way that they do in our visible reality. So that the field of information which we're working at here in the energetic architecture actually covers all space, and things move instantly from one place to the other. This is what the new field of quantum computing is really working on. When you change one thing here, it changes there instantly. So what they basically proved, to cut a long story short, is that human intention affects matter, affects otherwise random events. And they did some very interesting research into groups as well, and found that as groups cohered around a shared purpose, that also affected this random event generator in the computer. So that rather than, if we are incoherent as a group and we're not sure what we're doing together, then life will just happen in its kind of otherwise random way. But if we have a shared vision and we're all aligned behind that shared vision, then we start to affect and impact that randomness. So when people talk about synchronicity, I have a very clear vision about something, and then things start popping up, which, surprise us because they're so aligned with what we're trying to do. Well, that's related to the reality that they showed at Princeton, which was when we get coherent about something and have a clear intention, it starts to affect the otherwise random nature of events and bring things to us, attract things to us that resonate with the intention or the shared purpose that we have. So it's some of those principles that inform the way in this particular practice through the Center for Ecotherapy that we go about engaging with this energetic architecture. So as you look at this one, we look at how can we start to intervene? What are the different approaches you can take? So this builds on the first slide where we were looking at what the different elements of energetic architecture are. So for example, one of the things we can do is help to ground the organization. so it shapes up more coherently, so it's more connected to the reality on the ground, where the ideas become more real and more possible. They're things we can actually start to deliver, not just pipe dreams. Another thing we can do is help to bring the organization into appropriate contact with its own information field. So if it's got this field of information, how do we help bring that information into the system so that it enters our relational field and enters the material field and actually starts to be integrated in the practice of the organization? We can help a system to access information from other information fields if it doesn't have it contained in its own one. So if an organization or a woodland or a community, for example, is faced with a challenge that it's never faced before, then it might well have to find its solution outside of its own system, outside of its own information field. And so there are ways that you can help a system bring information from elsewhere that are more information that's more relevant and appropriate to the challenge that it's facing. You can clear blockages and stress in a system that are preventing the life energy from flowing. In the same way that at the individual level, if you look at something like acupuncture or acupressure, you're finding locations in the body where energy is blocked, and then by inserting the needle, you're releasing the energy so the system as a whole becomes more vital and information can flow properly through it. Well, it's the same thing at the collective level. You can find where the blockages are, help transform them so that the energy can continue to move. Finally, one of the things we can do is actually work with the life energy of the system and increase it so that it's more able to deal with the new information and things that's coming in. So what I'd like to share with you now is more detail about how does that actually work in concrete practice. And that's this one example through the work of the Center for Ecotherapy. And as I describe this, like some of the meeting processes from Holacracy, I'm just looking to give you a feel for it so you can see that there are really some concrete ways of doing this. This by no means means that you're suddenly able or qualified to do it, but you can see that there are methods that you can learn to work very concretely with the energetic architecture of organizations. So these are the steps in the practice. Imagine that you have an organization or a community or a farmer that has a certain project. You have to say, okay, what are you wanting to achieve within the next year? So you have to put a time boundary on it. Okay, within this period, I'm wanting to achieve this and this. And you have to define what it is you're working with. So what is the name of this project? It has to have a name, and it has to have a time dimension to it with goals. It's like kind of saying, well, you know, I'm here now, and in 6 months' time or in a year's time, I want to climb Mount Everest. Because then when you do your assessment, you're looking at, okay, if this is your end goal, we know that you need to have a certain level of fitness to be able to achieve that goal, and we'll develop a program for you to make sure that over the next year, you develop the fitness that enables you to climb Mount Everest. So we've defined a project, we've defined the goals, and we then do an initial scan, an intake scan, where we assess some of the parameters that we talked about earlier. You know, how grounded is it? How much stressed and blocked energy? How much life energy is in the system? Based on where the system is now in relationship to the goals that we want to achieve over the next year. So we do that scan, and then based on that scan, we'll ask the system, using some of the dowsing techniques, the body-based techniques, we'll ask the organization or the community, whatever level it is, what's the intervention that you now need to be able to take the next step? And often, in my experience of working with these practices, the first thing is grounding. The system needs grounding. And often, you know, we need to have a good at least 40% grounding in the system before you can even start doing anything else. What we found is if you start to try to bring in other interventions before the system is at least 40% grounded, then they just disappear off because there's not enough of a container to be able to hold them. So we do this initial scan, and then we have a meeting with the person who's responsible for that system. So we call them in English the steward. And this can be the boss of the department or the organization. It can be the warden of the piece of land or the farmer who owns the farm. But that person at an energetic architecture level is really the one who's most influencing the energetic architecture and field of that system. So they've already given us permission to be doing this, to do this exploration. We talk to them about what we found. We relate what we've picked up through the energetic information to their experience of how things are working on the ground, and then explain to them how we move forward. And what we'll do is, after we've done that initial assessment, we'll ask what needs to happen next. So maybe it says, I need grounding. And what we do is we create what we call a holon, which is like a picture or a diagram of the system, of the organization or the community. And that can be, if it's a place, like a piece of land, a small version of a map of the piece of land, or it could be the name of the initiative or the project. But you have that image or that name at the center of a piece of paper. You put a circle around it, which acts a little like a sound box. So it contains the energy of the system. And you have it on a piece of paper. And that's how you get into contact with the energetic architecture of the system. So there's much that's been written about this in other contexts, some of which you can find in the resource section, around what they would call a fractal approach, that things exist at many different levels. So just by having a photograph of somebody at one level, you can get in touch with them. By having a map of the land, you can get in touch with its energetic architecture. So it's through this piece of paper, very simple, that has the map on it, that you can get your information non-locally at a distance, like they proved in the Princeton project, at a distance, get the information about the system. So you've got this, you've met the steward, you've made your holon, you've asked what the next step is, and let's say it says we want grounding, which is a typical thing at the beginning. That's you douse. What of these different things, what would you like next? And it comes up with grounding. And you say, well, we have these different symbols in our toolkit that seem to work well for grounding. And you kind of go around them and you check which ones of these are likely to work best. And you check percentage-wise. For example, this would be an 80% fit, 90%, and then you find one which should be 100% fit. And so you take the symbol and you ask, okay, how many minutes a time do you need this? And how many times a week? And maybe it says 5 times a week for 2 minutes. So for 5 days in the week, you have your bit of paper that has your map on. You take the symbol, you put it on the bit of paper, and what happens energetically is that the frequency or the resonance of that symbol starts to interact with the energetic architecture of the system through the map. It's very simple in a way. But you can see how the research that they did at Princeton and a lot of the work understanding quantum physics can explain how that kind of thing can happen. And so just by putting the symbol on the map, we start to affect the energetic architecture of the system. And you then ask, so when do you need me to check in again? It's like, the doctor is getting you fit to be able to climb Mount Everest. He says, well, do these exercises and then come back in 2 weeks and we'll check up and see how you're doing. So when's the next checkup? And the next checkup, let's say it's in 10 days' time. So in 10 days' time, you check those energetic parameters again, see where it's at, and ask, what intervention do you need now? And generally, that process will last for 6 to 9 months of working, often 5 days a week, for a couple of minutes a time with the system, with these different symbols, to get it to a point where those energetic parameters we talked about come into a certain level of coherence, where you could say the energetic architecture is coherent and starts to positively influence the relational and the material architecture. So where the blocked and stressed energy has been taken out, where the ideas are now really integrated into the organization. The organization's able to respond to new ideas and start to turn them into action. It's well grounded and very realistic about what it's trying to do. And during that period, you're checking in occasionally with the steward of the system to see how what you're picking up energetically about the organization relates to their experience in real time. So think of it as like another data point. One thing we can do is we can be looking at our sales figures, checking out our employee satisfaction, and this is another data point. What's the energetic architecture telling us about our organization? So over time, it starts to bring the field of this system into coherence. And you start to see how if much more effective the organization starts to become, how there's a lot more flow and synchronicity in the organization. Things seem to happen by chance. You meet the right person, or you make a discovery that you hadn't thought of making before. These are all the kind of things that have been documented over the years of working with this approach through the Center for Ecotherapy. So there are three main phases. We have this balancing phasing, is what I described just now, where you're really working maybe almost daily with the organization. Once you've reached these coherent values, there's then what's called the stabilization phase, and that's a phase where all the kind of different parts of the organization start to come into alignment with the organization as a whole. And then there's a period where you're just continuing on and checking in on the system every so often. So that's very simply, in a nutshell, an example of how you can work with an organization very concretely at the energetic level. It's at the moment in the Netherlands, it's a 4-year vocational training process. So you'll understand that what I shared with you now is really just a very small amount of the information available. But you can find much more in the resource section and, of course, on the website. A lot of it's still in Dutch, but part of what we're going to be doing at Ubiquity is looking to bring this approach in English to into the English-speaking world. So that's how you work to make an energetic intervention with an organization. One of the other pieces that I in particular have been exploring here is, so what are the implications of leadership for this? If we assume that there is this energetic dimension to our organizations, that it has an energetic architecture, and we know that the steward of this system, the leader of this system, you could say, influences through their awareness and intention, as we saw in the Princeton project. If they influence this energetic reality, then what would be some tips for leaders who are able to accept that reality in terms of how would you go about your behavior? What are things to bear in mind in terms of how you positively influence the energetic architecture of your organization? So I'd just like to share with you a few of those principles, that some of which have come out of the ecotherapy experience and some of which have come out of my direct experience working as a leader consciously, energetically with the organizations that I've led. So I've called these principles for leading from the field. And the first principle is what I've called boundaries. Know the boundaries of your leadership. So what's very important working energetically is to define what it is that you're working with. So know, is it your department? Is it the organization as a whole? Where are the boundaries of your land that you're accountable for? Know those boundaries. Who and what are you accountable for? What exactly are you leading? And be in an authentic relationship with those that you're accountable to. So if you're in an organization and you have your own department and then there's a boss above you, then make sure that the relationship to that person is also as clear and clean as it can be. The next is the principle of stillness, and we touched on this in some of the mindfulness work. One of the things about working at the energetic level is that it's not a dimension that we can work with in the world around us. It's not stuff we can see and measure. You access information about that level from inside of yourself. So that's why it's so important to develop a practice such as the one we experimented with, where you come into a level of stillness in yourself, where you're able to quiet your mind, because the mind is not the place that you're going to be able to access this information from. We have to learn to work from an inner space, a more intuitive knowing than it is that we're used to. So cultivating that ability helps us to work more consciously with the energetic architecture of our systems. The third is intention. As we talked about in the Princeton project, it's now basically been proved almost beyond a doubt, because they spent so many years working on it at Princeton and had to continually improve the scientific evidence, that intention affects reality. So for a leader who's leading an organization, to be really clear on what it is that you're wanting to create, on your ambitions for the future, and to start visualizing those, to start really imagining what that reality might look like, and to be very clear with those intentions, to keep them in your awareness the whole time, will increase the likelihood of you actually reaching those goals, because it'll bring that reality into the energetic architecture, which will enable it to come into the relational and into the material. Presence. So this is about keeping a certain lightness in your quality of being in the organization. As we've talked about, in these times, it's important to be light and experimental. But also at the energetic level, energy moves when we're light and open. When we start to get serious and contracted, things start to block up. So if we want the energy to keep flowing, we need to try to keep ourselves open, keep ourselves light, and that will enable things to keep moving through. Notice what things start to emerge. Be really present with our reality so that we can really see what's actually there rather than what we think is going to be there or what we want to be there from our experience of the past. The next one is the principle around attention. As energetically as a leader, where we put our attention is where we direct the energy. You know, they say where you put your attention is what grows. So it's very important to be paying attention to all the different elements of the system that you're leading. So if you have many departments in your organization or many different areas within the community or many different parts of your land, to make sure that in your mind you're taking those into account, that you're thinking about all these different pieces. Because if there's a piece which you don't pay attention to, then gradually the energy will drop out of that area. People will start to get discouraged and it'll become a drain on the organization as a whole. So to keep your attention on the system as a whole and all the different parts. The next principle focuses on feeling. So where attention is more about our awareness, we talked about this in the piece around other leadership qualities for emergence. It's important to be really in touch with the people in the organization, more from a heart place than from a head place. So how are people feeling about their work? What's going on? That's a source of information that doesn't always show up in the statistics, but it's a very important one because it determines people's motivation. So to make sure that you have a feel of the key issues in the organization, that will also make sure that the energy stays coherent in the field. The next one is content. So be actively interested in the content of what people are doing. One of the trends that there has been more recently is to bring in managers who are maybe good at people managing, but actually know nothing about the content of what's being done in the organization. And that's proven to have a lot of problems because you can be very good at managing people, but if you have no understanding of what they're working on, then they don't have you're unlikely to get a very good relationship because people are passionate about the content of what they're working on. So you don't want to just be looking at managing them if you don't really understand what it is that they're passionate about and what it is that they're working on. So make sure that you develop an interest in the content of what it is people are actually doing. The next one is around pain. Often things have happened in the past in an organization that have created some kind of pain or disturbance or hurt. And that, unless it's cleared up, can kind of draw the energy out of the system and can start to create blockages because people don't dare to talk about something or they don't dare to do something that they did before because the last time they tried it, it turned out badly. So it's important as a leader to be aware of where's the hurt that's being carried in the organization? Where are some of the pain points from the past that we need to bring into our awareness and help to transform because they're holding energy. And unless we release those, that energy will continue to exert a pull on the organization from the past. So to bring past trauma into the present and transform it to release that energy. As a footnote, that's often very important around founders of an organization. If someone has founded the organization, they're holding a very core seed energy for the organization. And if they've been kicked out of the organization or they've left the organization on bad terms, that will often create a very uneasy dynamic in the energetic architecture. So it's important to pay attention to those transitions, particularly from founders into an organization as it moves into the future. The next principle is about place. So in the Eastern traditions, this is often normal, that we understand that the physical place we locate ourselves is very important, that there are many different energies in the earth that you can measure, places that are more stressful, places that give us energy more. So to be very conscious of the place that we locate ourselves as an organization, the place that we're operating in, and just bring that into our awareness, if that's the minimum we do, just to be aware of the place we're in. In a lot of the Eastern traditions, they'll think very carefully about how you actually situate your organization, the angle, how it relates to the different directions, north, south, east, west. All of these things play an important part and come out of some ancient wisdom that we've often forgotten, particularly in the West. Another important principle is the principle that I've called form. So, if we think of everything as having a certain energy or resonance, words themselves carry energy, carry resonance. Numbers have a certain resonance to them. Geometry and form does. Certain forms give us more energy than other forms. So as we think about the design of our places, to be more conscious of which forms are more energy giving and which forms are more energy draining. It is important what we call our organizations, how we name things. Names carry energy. And you can find more on this in the resource section. But to be very conscious of that, not to be flippant with our words, our language, our numbers, and our geometry, to be very conscious of the fact that that does impact our energetic reality. Timing. There are certain rhythms of time. And many different approaches that have been looked at over there. One of the more interesting ones is the whole Elliott wave, which has been used a lot on the stock market. They tracked how the stock market went up and down and noticed that there were certain rhythms and patterns in that. And you can generalize out from that and see times where the organization is more fit to be moving out into the world, and other times where it's more likely to be inward focused and developing new ideas and new concepts. So to start to look into this whole area of time and rhythms of time and noticing when things tend to work better and when things don't. Progress. And we've talked about that in the context of governance and things. Really just focusing on the simplest next natural step. Coming present the whole time to what's real now in the organization and looking at what feels like the next step to take. Not worrying about taking too many steps into the future, but really focusing on the present and the next little step that we have to take. So there's a number of principles come out of experience and practices about what it means when you're a leader to accept that there is an energetic dimension to things, an invisible dimension that we can't see so much, but that informs our relationships and our material level of reality, and how we can start to take that more into account in terms of the way that we lead. So in the final session, what we'll be doing is looking at one other example that's been around for a while of people working more consciously with the energetic dimensions, with a different language to it, but that has worked particularly well, particularly in working with gardens and natural environments, and more recently been translated into organizational contexts as well.